In this video, we're going to look at the different ways that we can interpret uh, a linear model that we create in R. So ideally, we'd like to report the results of a linear model in ways that are not only easy to understand in themselves, but are also easy to compare across different linear models that you might create. So one way to do this is with the Broom package, which contains a number of functions for displaying the results of linear models. One of these is the tidy function, which you can see here. This takes a linear model as an argument, like in this code here, and it displays the coefficients of that model in a nicely formatted table by converting them into a data frame. So this is an example of the output, and you can see that the first column describes the different terms of the model. So we have the intercept, and then we have the different variables, explanatory variables that were in the model. And then we have in the second column the estimate of that coefficient. So the estimate here is the estimate of the intercept, 5.389. And then the next three are the estimates of the slopes for these three explanatory variables. One thing to remember is that these slopes in a multiple linear regression represent how the response variable will change if you change that explanatory variable by 1 unit while holding the other explanatory variables constant. Another interesting column that we get out of the tidy function is this last one, p.value. This reports a p-value for each of these coefficients, which represents a hypothesis test. So you might ask, well, what is the null hypothesis in this case, which we're calculating the probability of, the p-value? And in a linear model, the null hypothesis for the intercept is that the intercept is 0. In this case, you can see the p-value is 0.33, or in other words, a 33% chance that the null hypothesis is 0. And so in this case, we would not be able to reject the null hypothesis, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is, a useless model, because maybe we were expecting the intercept to be 0, right? But it's just something to bear in mind, because in some cases, right, in the cases of the explanatory variables, like we see in the next 3 rows, the null hypothesis is that the slope is 0. So with explanatory 1 and explanatory 2, we can see that we've got p-values that are so small that we can't distinguish them from 0. So in this case, right, we would be able to reject the null hypothesis that the slope, the coefficients for these 2 variables are 0. However, in this third case, for explanatory 3, we would not be able to reject the null hypothesis. In other words, we don't have a statistically significant correlation between explanatory variable 3 and the response variable. One other thing to note about this function is that if you wish to show the confidence intervals for any of these coefficients, you can add the conf.int argument equals true to the tidy function to display 2 extra columns here that show the confidence intervals. The Broom package also contains a function called glance. This displays information about the model as a whole. One particularly useful bit of information is R², which you can see here, both R² and adjusted R². However, there are a lot of different statistics that this function reports, as you can see if we scroll to the right through this table. If you try to use this inside a PDF, then when you knit to a PDF, you'll find that this table does not format nicely within a page because there are so many columns. So what you'll want to do is pipe the output, because the output of glance is a data frame. We can pipe it on to the select function and then just pick the columns that we actually want to report. So here we're showing the R squared column, right? This first one, which is 0.72, and this represents the fraction of the response variable that the model explains. So we're essentially saying that this model can explain about 72% of the variation in the response variable. However, in multiple linear regression, what we find is that every additional explanatory variable we add in will decrease the R squared value just because of how it's calculated, even if we add in an explanatory variable that doesn't actually explain anything about the response variable. So in the cases of multiple linear regression, we usually want to use adjusted R squared, the second column that we picked here, which is calculated slightly differently so that it does not increase with additional explanatory variables that don't have any explanatory power. And this makes it better for comparing across multiple linear regression models that might use different numbers of explanatory variables. The final thing we've reported here is another p-value, and this is for the model as a whole rather than any of the individual coefficients. And the null hypothesis here is that at least one explanatory variable is statistically significantly correlated with the response variable, rather than looking at the different explanatory variables one by one.